I'm a certified forensic document examiner. Banks call me when a signature doesn't sit right, when the pressure changes halfway through a letter, when a loop closes a fraction of a second too late, when something on paper is trying very hard to look like the truth and almost gets there. I've testified in courtrooms. I've sat across from men in expensive suits and told a jury, calmly, that the line in front of them was a lie, and watched their faces understand that the lie was over. I tell you this so you understand the irony of what happened to me, because if I had read this story instead of lived it, I wouldn't have believed it either. The one time in my life when my own name was on the line, when it was my signature being questioned, nobody asked the expert in the room. They just assumed I was the criminal. My mother used to say, I came out of the womb suspicious. She wasn't wrong. I noticed things. I noticed that my sister's stories changed in small, specific ways depending on who she was talking to. I noticed that she remembered conversations more favorably than they happened. I noticed and said nothing for almost 30 years, because that's what you do in families like mine. You notice and you stay quiet because the alternative is being called dramatic or jealous or worse. My mother's name was Eleanor Bennett. She taught third grade for 34 years in the same elementary school, 2 blocks from the house she raised us in. She was the kind of teacher who kept a drawer of granola bars for kids who came in hungry, who drove students home in the rain without telling anyone, who showed up at our high school graduations of children who weren't even hers because nobody else could. When she retired, 400 people came to the school gymnasium. Former students flew in from 3 states. A man in his 40s stood up and said she was the only adult who ever told him he was smart and that he became an engineer because of one sentence she said to him in 1991. That's the kind of person my mother was. Which is exactly why what happened to her in the last 8 months of her life makes my hands shake even now when I think about it. My sister's name is Tasha. She's 2 years older than me, and growing up, she was the one who got remembered. Not because she did more, because she performed more. She cried louder, laughed louder, hugged longer in front of people. I did the homework, the dishes, the quiet things nobody photographs. By the time we were adults, the family had a story about us that nobody ever said out loud, but everyone believed. Tasha was warm. I was cold. Tasha needed protecting. I could take care of myself. I'm telling you this not to complain about my childhood. I'm telling you this because it's the exact reason what happened later worked as well as it did. The lie only needs one thing to survive, an audience that's already decided which one of you is the good daughter before the facts arrive. My mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 14 months before she died. The doctors gave her, at most, a year. She took the news the way she took everything, calmly with a list. She wanted her affairs in order. She wanted to die in her own house, the one my father built additions onto with his own hands before he passed 11 years earlier. She told me very specifically, no drama and no fighting over what's left when I'm not here to referee it. I should have known that sentence meant she was already afraid of something. For the first few months after the diagnosis, things were almost normal. I drove up most weekends, I live 90 minutes away, and sat with her while she did her treatments, made her the soup she actually liked instead of the bland stuff the pamphlets recommended, helped her organize the paperwork that comes with dying in America, which turns out to be enormous. Tasha visited too, when it photographed well. Mother's Day. The week chemo started because there were balloons and casseroles from neighbors, and it felt, I think, like being in a movie about a good daughter. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't bitter about that, at least a little. But I told myself it didn't matter who showed up how often. My mother was dying. That was the only fact that mattered. I was wrong. There was a second fact that mattered just as much, and I didn't find out about it until a Tuesday morning in October, when a woman named Patricia from the fraud department of Heritage Crestview Bank called my cell phone at 9:14 a.m. and asked me to confirm my identity for security purposes before discussing, quote, irregularities on a recent loan application bearing your signature. I remember saying, I haven't applied for any loan. I remember her saying, that's actually what we need to talk to you about. The loan was a home equity line of credit, $58,000, secured against my mother's house. The house had been paid off since 2009. The application listed my mother as the primary borrower and listed me, Claire Bennett, as co-signer and guarantor, which the bank required given my mother's lack of current income and her diagnosis. My signature was on 4 separate pages. I had never seen the document before in my life. Here's where my job became a kind of curse instead of a gift. I asked Patricia to send me the signature pages. She wasn't supposed to. There was already a fraud flag on the account and an internal investigation underway. But because I was a bank employee myself, just at a different institution, with verified credentials, she made an exception and emailed scanned copies under a confidentiality agreement an hour later. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my own name in my own handwriting, and I knew within 4 seconds that I hadn't written it. The pressure was wrong. My signature has a specific lift between the C and the L, a habit from writing checks left-handed as a kid before a teacher made me switch, that almost nobody replicates because almost nobody studies my signature that closely. Whoever forged this had practiced. They had access to real samples of my handwriting, probably old birthday cards or the guarantor forms from when I co-signed my mother's car loan 4 years earlier. But they'd gotten the lift wrong. The C connected too smoothly. A person who didn't know me, copying from a photograph, would never have known to fake that hesitation. A person who'd watched me sign things for 30 years, on the other hand, would know it existed, but might not know exactly how to reproduce a habit they'd never consciously studied. I want to be honest with you. In that moment, sitting at my table, I already suspected my sister. I didn't want to. I spent the next 40 minutes trying to construct any other explanation because the alternative meant something in my family was broken in a way I couldn't unsee. I called the bank back and told them I believed I was the victim of identity fraud, that I had not signed those documents, and that I wanted to formally dispute the loan and request a forensic signature comparison. Patricia told me, not unkindly, that given my professional background, the bank's compliance department would need to treat my dispute with additional scrutiny because a forensic document examiner disputing her own forged signature is, statistically, exactly the kind of claim a guilty person makes to cover their tracks. I had spent 11 years building a career on the principle that experts catch liars. I had never once considered what happens when the system looks at the expert and sees a liar instead. That was the day everything started to fall. I drove to my mother's house that same afternoon, the $58,000 bank letter still warm from my printer, sitting on the passenger seat like something radioactive. I had a plan on the drive up that involved sitting my mother down and asking her, gently, whether she remembered signing anything, whether someone had visited and asked her to sign papers she didn't fully understand. People with cancer get confused. People on pain medication sign things. I was prepared to find out my mother had been taken advantage of by a stranger, a contractor, a scam caller who'd shown up at her door. I was not prepared for what I actually found. I let myself in with my key, the way I always did, and I heard crying before I saw anyone. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done homework for 18 years, with her hands flat in front of her, staring at nothing, tears running steadily down a face that had already gotten so thin from the chemo that I sometimes had to remind myself, looking at her, that this was still the woman who used to carry 2 of us at once on her hip while making dinner. "Mom," I said. "What happened?" She looked up at me, and for a second, just a second, I saw something in her face that wasn't grief. It was something sharper, calculating almost. Then it was gone, replaced by the exhaustion that lived there now most of the time, and she said, "Nothing, sweetheart. I'm just tired." I sat down across from her and told her about the bank, about the loan, about my signature on documents I never signed. I watched her face very carefully while I talked, the way I would watch a face on the stand. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone hearing a thing she'd already half known confirmed out loud.
"Mom,
"Did you sign something? Did someone come to the house?" "Claire." Her voice was very quiet. "I need you to not do anything yet. Mom, this is fraud. Someone forged my name. We need to call the police. We need." I said not yet. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and her hand was so light, so much lighter than it used to be, that it scared me more than anything she'd said. "I'm asking you."
please."
"Not yet. I want you to understand how strange this request was, coming from her. My mother was not a passive woman. She once made a school district change its entire free lunch policy because she refused to let a single hungry 7-year-old fall through a bureaucratic gap. She did not say "not yet" about injustice. She confronted injustice the way other people confront bad weather, directly, immediately, with an umbrella already in hand. But she said it twice more before I left that night, and there was something underneath the exhaustion in her eyes that I would only understand months later, something that looked less like a woman avoiding a fight, and more like a woman who already had a plan and wasn't ready to show her hand. I went home that night, and I didn't call the police. I told myself I was respecting my dying mother's wishes. The truth, looking back, is that I was also afraid. Afraid of what confronting Tasha directly, without proof beyond my own professional opinion, would look like to the rest of the family, a forensic examiner pointing a finger at her own sister, using her job title as a weapon. I knew exactly how that would sound to people who'd already decided, decades ago, which one of us was difficult. I was right to be afraid. I just didn't yet understand how bad it was going to get before it got better. 3 weeks later, my Aunt Carol called a family meeting. Not me, Tasha had asked her to. The pretense was supporting Mom through this difficult time, which is the kind of phrase my sister has always been extremely good at deploying. 12 of us crowded into my mother's living room on a Sunday afternoon, my mother propped up in her recliner with a blanket over her knees, too weak by then to host the way she used to, but too proud to let anyone see how much that cost her. Tasha stood up first. She always stood up first. "I think we need to talk about something hard," she said, and her voice cracked exactly where it needed to crack. "Claire has accused me, to the bank, of forging her signature on a loan I took out to help pay for Mom's care." I felt the room turn toward me before I even opened my mouth. "I didn't accuse you of anything," I said. "I told the bank I never signed those documents." "That's true. Someone did. And you think it was me?" Her voice wobbled. "After everything. After I've been here every week, after I gave up my business to help take care of Mom." That last part wasn't true. Tasha's boutique had closed 8 months earlier, before my mother was even diagnosed, after 2 years of mounting debt that I knew about because she'd asked to borrow money from me twice, and I'd said no both times. But saying that out loud, in that room, in that moment, would have made me sound exactly like what she was accusing me of being: bitter, jealous, keeping score. My Uncle Frank spoke next, the way he always did when he wanted to sound reasonable while taking a side. "Claire, sweetheart, I know your job makes you see fraud everywhere. But this is family. Maybe the bank just made a clerical error. I've seen the signature pages, Frank. I know what my own handwriting looks like." "You also know," Tasha said, very softly, very sadly, "that you've never liked seeing me get close to Mom. You've said it yourself. You think I don't do enough. Maybe. And I'm not saying this to be cruel. Claire, I love you. But maybe some part of you wanted this to be me." I will never forget the silence after she said that. I watched 8 family members who had known me my entire life sit in that silence and not say a single word in my defense. My own aunt reached over and patted Tasha's hand. My mother, in the recliner, said nothing either. She watched the whole exchange with an expression I couldn't read, and when I caught her eye, looking for any kind of anchor, she just gave the smallest shake of her head.
"Not now. Still not now."
I left that house feeling like I had been erased and replaced by a version of myself that existed only in other people's assumptions. It got worse from there, the way these things do when nobody intervenes early. The bank's internal investigation, slowed by my own dispute and the conflict of interest flag on my file, dragged into its 3rd month. Without a finalized fraud determination, the loan technically remained valid, and the 60-day window for my mother's first balloon payment was approaching. Tasha, positioning herself as the responsible daughter handling Mom's affairs since I was apparently too busy fighting the bank over a misunderstanding, began attending my mother's medical appointments and quietly asking her doctor about power of attorney paperwork, power of attorney that would, conveniently, give her full control over my mother's remaining accounts and the house itself. I found out about this not from my sister, not from my mother, but from a hospice intake coordinator who mentioned, in passing, that Tasha had already started the paperwork during a phone call meant to schedule something else entirely. I sat in my car in a hospital parking lot for 20 minutes after that call, doing something I rarely let myself do, which was cry without trying to solve anything at the same time. 2 relatives I'd grown up calling close stopped returning my texts. My uncle Frank told my husband, Mark, at a gas station they both happened to be at, that it's a shame what stress does to people, makes them see things that aren't there. A cousin posted something on social media, not naming me but close enough, about how some people would rather destroy their family than admit they're not perfect. The bank, separately, sent a letter informing me that given the unresolved nature of the dispute and discrepancies in the claimant's professional credibility assessment, their words, not mine, meaning my own employer had been quietly contacted as part of due diligence, and someone in their compliance office had raised a question about whether an examiner disputing her own signature represented a conflict that warranted suspension pending review. I was being placed on administrative leave.
For my job.
Paid, but indefinite. I had spent my entire adult life building a reputation as someone whose word about a signature meant something. In the space of 3 months, I had lost my job, my family's trust, and very nearly my mother's house, all because somebody had practiced my handwriting well enough to fool a teller, but not well enough to fool me, and nobody with power to do anything about it was willing to listen to the one person who actually knew the difference. This is usually the part of the story where the protagonist finds her proof in some dramatic, sudden moment. Mine wasn't dramatic.
It was a key.
My mother's housekeeper, a woman named Ruth who had cleaned that house every other Thursday for 19 years and loved my mother the way you love someone who remembers your children's names, called me on a Thursday evening in January, her voice low like she was worried about being overheard. "Claire, honey, I don't know if I should say anything," she said. "But your mother asked me to help remove a box from under her bed into the hall closet last week because it was getting too heavy for her to manage alone, and I think you should know it exists. She told me not to tell Tasha. She didn't say anything about you." I drove to my mother's house that night. She was awake, sitting up in bed reading, which by then took most of the energy she had left in a day. I sat on the edge of the mattress and I asked her, directly, what was in the box. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she set her book down, looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since I was small, and she was deciding whether I was old enough to hear something true, and said, "I was hoping I'd be the one to show you, when I was ready. Get the box, Claire. It's time." It was a fireproof lockbox, the kind you buy at a hardware store, and inside it was 8 months of my mother quietly building a case I didn't know existed. There were bank statements, copies she'd requested herself, going back 2 years, showing irregular cash withdrawals from an account Tasha had access to as an emergency contact, withdrawals that traced almost exactly to dates Ruth had once mentioned seeing Tasha's car at the casino 40 minutes outside town. There was a private investigator's report, 3 pages, dated, professional. My mother had hired him herself the month after her diagnosis, before any of this loan business had even started, because, she told me later, a mother knows when one of her children is drowning in something she's hiding. There was a sealed engagement letter from an independent forensic handwriting expert in another county. Not me, deliberately not me, my mother had been careful about that, who had been retained 6 weeks earlier to analyze the loan signature pages and compare them against verified samples of my actual handwriting. Samples my mother herself had collected from old birthday cards and school forms going back 15 years, without my ever noticing they were missing. There was a notebook, my mother's handwriting, dated entries going back to the week she first noticed the missing cash. And there was a single sealed envelope at the bottom of the box with my name on it, and beneath it, an unmarked one addressed simply, "For the attorney, upon my death." "Mom," I said, and I could barely get the word out. "You knew. This whole time. You knew it wasn't me." I suspected it the day the loan officer called me to confirm the application, and I heard myself thinking, before I'd even seen a single page, that something about the timing was wrong, she said. "You don't survive cancer treatment by trusting your first feeling about anything, Claire. You survive it by checking." So I checked. "Why didn't you tell me?" She reached over and took my hand, the same way she had at the kitchen table months earlier, except this time her grip was steadier, and I understood that the woman who'd told me, not yet, hadn't been weak. She'd been waiting. Because if I told you, you would have confronted her immediately, the way you confront everything, directly, with your job title as a shield. And Tasha would have destroyed every piece of evidence she had access to within 24 hours, the same way she destroyed the boutique's financial records before her old business partner could sue her. I needed the report finished. I needed it independent. And I needed, she said, and here her voice caught for the first time, to know for certain with my own eyes before I died which of my daughters had actually been telling me the truth. I asked her the question I'd been afraid to ask for 8 months. What do you want to do? I don't want revenge, Claire. She said it the way she used to say things to her students. Patient, final, the kind of sentence that ends an argument because it's simply true. Revenge is for people who need the world to see them win. I want something better than winning. I want the truth to exist in a room your sister can't argue her way out of, in front of people whose good opinion she actually wants to keep. And then I want the consequences to follow naturally, the way consequences are supposed to, instead of being managed away by people who love peace more than they love honesty. She had already amended her will. Quietly, with her own attorney, 11 weeks earlier, an attorney Tasha didn't know existed, separate from the family lawyer everyone assumed handled Mom's affairs. The new will contained a clause my mother had written herself, in her own words, before her attorney translated it into something a court would respect. Any beneficiary found, through independent forensic or legal determination, to have committed fraud against the estate or against another beneficiary in connection with estate assets would be automatically and entirely disinherited, their share redistributed according to a secondary plan sealed separately. My mother had spent the last 8 months of her life dying of cancer, raising a hostile, suspicious daughter's accusations against herself in private, hiring a private investigator and an independent forensic examiner, rewriting her will with a fraud clause built specifically for this exact situation, and doing all of it without a single outward sign of anything but exhaustion, so that the daughter actually committing the fraud would never see it coming until the moment my mother chose to let her see it. I need you to do one more thing for me, she said. I need you to wait. Let the bank's investigation finish on its own timeline. Let your sister keep believing she's winning. I know how hard that's going to be for you. But the version of this where she humiliates herself in front of people whose respect she actually craves is worth more than the version where you win an argument in this kitchen that nobody else will ever hear about. I want to tell you that waiting was easy once I had the truth in my hands. It wasn't. Knowing I was right and being unable to say so out loud, while watching my sister tell increasingly elaborate versions of her victimhood to anyone who'd listen, while watching aunts and cousins look at me with that particular blend of pity and suspicion reserved for the family member everyone's quietly decided is going through something, that was its own kind of slow, grinding pain. There were nights I sat in my car outside my mother's house after visiting and didn't drive home for almost an hour because I didn't trust myself to be around other people yet. But I waited because she asked me to, and because some part of me, the part that had spent 11 years learning that the truth, properly documented, eventually wins on its own terms, believed she was right. My mother died on a Tuesday morning in March, for months after that conversation, with me holding one hand and, to her credit and mine, Tasha holding the other. Whatever my sister had done, whatever was coming for her, I never once considered keeping her from saying goodbye to our mother. That wasn't my mother's plan, and it wasn't mine either. The reckoning my mother had built wasn't designed to be cruel. It was designed to be true. The funeral was large, 400 people again, just like her retirement, because that's what a life like hers earns. Former students who were now in their 50s stood up and spoke. A man who'd been homeless at 17 and was now a pediatric nurse talked about the $20 she'd slipped into his coat pocket every week for a year without ever mentioning it to anyone. The school's superintendent announced, at the reception afterward, that the district was naming the new reading room after her. Tasha cried beautifully through all of it. I'm not being unkind saying that. She has always cried beautifully, the way some people are simply gifted at certain things. I sat 3 rows back, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and I thought about the sealed envelope at the bottom of a lockbox, and I waited. The will reading was scheduled for the following week, in the conference room of Caldwell and Hayes, the second attorney's office, the one Tasha didn't know existed until the invitation arrived. My mother had specifically named, in writing, who was to be present, not just immediate family, but 6 additional witnesses she had chosen herself months earlier. Two of her former teaching colleagues, the school's current principal, a representative from the bank's compliance office who my mother had personally contacted weeks before her death to request his attendance as a courtesy. Given the bank's own interest in the matter, Ruth the housekeeper and the private investigator she'd hired, present in a professional capacity to confirm his findings if asked. I watched Tasha's face when she walked into that conference room and saw who else was sitting there. I watched the exact moment she understood this wasn't going to be the quiet, manageable family meeting she'd expected. Robert Caldwell, my mother's attorney, started the same way these readings always start. Formal language, the reading of the preamble, confirmation of the testator's sound mind at time of execution, witnessed and notarized 11 weeks before her death by two independent witnesses unrelated to the family. Tasha's leg was bouncing under the table. I recognized it because it's something I do too when I'm holding something in. Then Mr. Caldwell said, "Before I read the distribution of the estate, Mrs. Bennet left specific written instructions that a separate document be read into the record first, in the presence of the witnesses she designated. This document was prepared independently and is dated approximately 4 months prior to her passing." He opened a sealed folder. "This is a forensic handwriting analysis report prepared by Dr. Miriam Osei, a certified document examiner with no professional or personal relationship to either Claire or Tasha Bennet, commissioned directly and paid for by Eleanor Bennet." I watched my sister's face change in real time. Not crumble, not yet. First confusion. Then the specific, sliding panic of someone realizing the story they've been telling for months has just run into a wall built before they ever started telling it. Mr. Caldwell read the conclusion aloud, the language careful and clinical the way these reports always are, that the signatures attributed to Claire Bennet on the home equity loan documents in question showed, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, characteristics inconsistent with verified exemplars of Claire Bennet's handwriting and characteristics consistent, in several specific respects, pen lift patterns, baseline slant, and letter formation habits, with verified handwriting samples of Tasha Bennet Cole, provided for comparison from the estate of Eleanor Bennet. The room was completely silent. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I had spent 8 months learning, finally, what my mother had been trying to teach me my entire life, that the truth, properly built, doesn't need you to defend it in the moment. It defends itself, and it only needs you to have been patient enough to let it finish growing. "That's not," Tasha started, and her voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. "That report is biased. That's not. Mom wouldn't have." "Your mother commissioned it herself," Mr. Caldwell said, not unkindly, but without any softening either. "There is also, for the record, a signed and dated private investigator's report documenting a pattern of undisclosed gambling-related cash withdrawals from a joint emergency account, totaling approximately $31,000 over 14 months, predating your mother's diagnosis. And there is this." He held up the second sealed envelope, the one addressed to the attorney. "Your mother left a formal written complaint, prepared in consultation with myself and dated the same week as the forensic engagement, documenting her belief that fraud had been committed against her estate. Per her explicit instruction, that complaint was to be transmitted to the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division and to Heritage Crestview Bank's Fraud Department automatically, 30 days following her death, unless she personally rescinded it before that date. She did not rescind it. That 30-day period concluded yesterday. Both parties were notified this morning. I will never forget the sound my sister made. It wasn't a scream, and it wasn't elegant crying. It was something smaller and more honest than anything I'd heard from her in 30 years. A single, broken exhale, the sound of someone realizing the performance is over because the audience has already seen the truth without her permission. Uncle Frank, the same man who'd told me 3 months earlier that stress makes people see things that aren't there, didn't say a word. My Aunt Carol's hand, the one that had patted Tasha's in comfort that day in my mother's living room, was now pressed over her own mouth. Mr. Caldwell continued because the will itself still needed to be read, and my mother had built it to do exactly what she said she wanted. Let consequences follow naturally, in front of the people whose opinion actually mattered to the person who'd earned them. The fraud clause activated automatically upon independent confirmation. Tasha was disinherited in full, No house, no savings, no portion of the modest investment account my parents had built over 4 decades. Her share, per the secondary distribution plan, was redirected. A portion to the elementary school's new reading program in my mother's name, a portion to the hospice organization that had cared for her, and the remainder, along with the house and her status as executor, to me. There was one more clause, the one that told me, more than anything else in that room, exactly who my mother had been. The will required that the funds redirected from Tasha's share be used to establish the Eleanor Bennett Fund for Honesty, administered through the school district, awarding a yearly scholarship not to the highest achieving student, but to the student a panel of teachers identified as having shown the most personal integrity that year, the kid who told the truth when it cost them something. My mother had built her own posthumous justice not around punishing her daughter, but around planting, permanently, the exact value that daughter had betrayed. I want to tell you, the next part felt like victory. It didn't, not the way you'd expect. I sat in that conference room and watched my sister fall apart in front of people who had known her since childhood, and what I felt wasn't triumph. It was grief, layered on top of grief. For a mother I'd just buried, and for a sister I'd just lost in a different, more permanent way than death. The loss of any remaining story, where she was who I needed her to be. The district attorney's office moved on the financial crimes referral within 6 weeks. Combined with the bank's own internal fraud findings, which, once the independent forensic report became part of the record, resolved my own dispute almost instantly and triggered a formal apology and reinstatement letter from Heritage Crestview, along with a quiet internal review of how a fraud victim with verified credentials had been treated as a suspect for 4 months. Tasha was charged with forgery and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a charge made significantly more serious by our mother's terminal diagnosis at the time of the loan application. She didn't go to trial. Her attorney negotiated a plea 7 months later, restitution to the bank in full, 5 years of probation, and a forgery conviction that will follow her for the rest of her life. Derek, her husband, filed for divorce 4 months after the will reading. I heard, secondhand, through Aunt Carol, who reached out to me eventually with an apology I accepted carefully and without pretending the previous months hadn't happened, that Tasha moved to a smaller apartment 2 towns over and rarely speaks to anyone from the family. I didn't celebrate any of it. I went back to work at the bank, reinstated with back pay and, I'll admit, a noticeably different level of institutional respect than I'd had before, the kind of respect you only get after an organization realizes how badly it almost failed you. I became the executor my mother needed me to be, settling the estate, opening the scholarship fund, sitting on the small selection panel myself every spring, watching teachers argue passionately about which 13-year-old had shown the most quiet courage that year. I think about my mother's not yet almost every day now. At the time, it felt like she was asking me to be smaller than I wanted to be, to swallow an injustice while everyone around me believed the worst version of who I was. I understand now that she was asking me to be larger than the moment, in a way I wasn't capable of seeing while I was still inside it. She wasn't protecting Tasha. She was protecting the truth, giving it the time it needed to finish becoming undeniable, instead of letting it get cut short by a fight that would have let everyone walk away still arguing about who started it. It's been a year and a half now. The reading room at the elementary school has her name on a brass plaque by the door. The first Eleanor Bennett Fund scholarship went to a 16-year-old boy who returned a wallet with $1,100 in it to a stranger at a gas station and didn't tell anyone until a teacher found out by accident. I sat in the audience when they announced it, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral because I understood, finally, completely, what my mother had actually built in those last 8 months of her life. Not a trap for her daughter. A legacy for the value her daughter had abandoned. If there's someone in your life who has ever quietly believed in you, who saw the truth before anyone else was willing to and waited, and built something patient instead of loud, because they trusted that the truth doesn't need to shout to win, I hope you tell them while you still can. I didn't get the chance to thank my mother for what she did until it was already finished without me. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that patience isn't the same as weakness, and that the truth, given enough time, always finds the room it needs to be heard in. And if you've ever had a moment like mine, where the truth finally arrived, in front of exactly the people who needed to see it. I'd love to hear it in the comments.